For some of us, we get to a point where we realize we don't actually agree with our mental health disorder that we were diagnosed with. Maybe we were diagnosed with ADHD or anxiety disorder or borderline or something like that. Maybe we got it from a psychiatrist or a therapist. And I think for a lot of us, especially if we were diagnosed as kids, it doesn't actually dawn on us that this is something that it's even an option for us to disagree with. Because it's often not presented that way, right? It's presented like it is an objective scientific fact. You know, sort of like if you have diabetes, you have diabetes. Disagreeing with it doesn't serve us. It's not really a thing. But the reality is, and it's really important to keep this in mind, mental health diagnosis is by and large something completely different than that. Even though it's presented as sort of being similar to medicine in this way, it is actually fundamentally very different. It's a very different epistemology, right? In mental health, there is no deeper mechanism that is understood for any of these disorders. There's no deeper like etiology that's understood, right? There is no biological or psychological mechanism that is like scientifically grounded for what we're going through. No, what it is one particular way of looking at and framing what is going on for us. But if that's all that it is, then we can look at it in different ways if we so choose. And that is exactly what this video is about. Now, just a quick disclaimer here. This video is not mental health advice or professional advice of any kind. I am not a mental health professional. And in this video, I'm not telling anybody to disregard their diagnosis or the diagnosis of any mental health professional. What's being said here is more like personal and philosophical reflection. Now, back on this topic of looking at our mental health diagnoses and potentially, ourselves choosing to kind of move beyond them if we decide that we don't like them anymore. I think like one of the really tricky things is that often we're not even really sure, especially if we were given these things when we were kids, we're often not even really sure if we actually have the right to do that. Like if we're really allowed to disagree with our diagnosis. And quite frankly, I think, at least in many cases, this might actually be a gray area, which is itself, I think, is a very disturbing question around human rights. Now, what is this process of kind of recognizing this, of like recognizing that like ultimately we don't actually agree with our diagnosis and we want to kind of move to a new place in ourselves and in our lives? I think that often it kind of starts with a certain inkling within us. For me, it started with this realization that started to emerge that actually like I had kind of had this whole self that had been sort of broken down by my environment when I was a kid. And that was in large part through diagnosis, right? I had all these feelings and perspectives and desires that were not really tolerated because my environment was very broken and very dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And so I started to realize that it was never really about me. But the diagnosis is like saying, no, it's all about you. It's not about the environment. But I realized that was just wrong. So fundamentally, I think that this is about untangling identity that gets shaped by mental health professionals whose influence we didn't really consent to. And, they don't really know us. But their virtually unbounded interpretive authority becomes how we understand ourselves. And so it's really about like learning to relate to our inner life again in a way that's not mediated by these authorities whose influence can be pretty damaging in many cases. Now, first, let's look at where these childhood diagnoses come from, particularly in cases where we ultimately realize that we don't agree with them. Well, I would say with kids, very often, and I'm inclined to say most of the time, but I don't know empirically, but I would say much of the time, what I think is happening is it's basically a way of kind of saying like, the problem isn't with your environment, And it's not the fact that you're just naturally responding like a human being to your environment. The problem is just like basically about some kind of individual pathology within you. And so in that way, like I would characterize it as basically like a form of what I would call epistemic violence, right? It's like a way of kind of like an expert authority characterizing your situation in a way that that really doesn't serve you. It doesn't benefit you, and it's actually like a really damaging and really kind of harmful way of characterizing the situation. So in school, right, we often get labeled with a psychiatric disorder because we're not like doing what that environment expects or in the way that it expects. But like if we step back and actually like look at the situation for what it is, we see that this is a very rigid, very authoritarian educational system. And so like it's only natural to resist that because it's bad for you. And so in that sense, the diagnosis is really like a direct tool of authoritarian control of that system. And it's kind of a similar dynamic in a lot of families, right? Like we're in an environment that maybe is emotionally and psychologically abusive. And sometimes that can be like really hard to see. It can be sort of like invisible to outsiders, particularly ones that like don't have a lot of awareness themselves. And so, you know, like we're feeling the pain of that family system, and we have feelings and reactions to that, and we're suffering in that context, and we're coping how we can. Well, again, you know, the psychiatric diagnosis in many cases is like saying like, it's like picking apart the little ways that we're responding to that, you know, like fitting it into a box based on a checklist, and then saying that that is our problem. Again, it's a form of epistemic violence. And so when we eventually start to see that like these were the kind of dynamics that were shaping us, and it was in this kind of context that we were labeled with a psychiatric disorder, it becomes natural to question that and start to feel like really that was never a fit, and there was a whole lot wrong with being labeled with one of these disorders. And I'm not at all saying that anybody should look at their situation that way, but I am saying if you do ultimately see your situation that way, you're not alone. I was the same way, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, why is this so destructive? I think fundamentally it's because kids are still forming their selves. So these diagnoses are not just an extremely bad way of describing what's going on. They also act to organize your emerging self. They foreclose other paths. And the people doing this to kids, I think, are often very irresponsible because they're not really considering how heavily this kind of thing is conditioning kids. And so one thing that happens with childhood diagnosis is it creates what you could call narrative foreclosure. And so all of these things that are normally seen as part of your humanity are now seen as part of your disorder, right? Your anger, your, you know, the different pain you're experiencing, right? Maybe you're withdrawing, like whatever these behaviors are. So instead of being seen as, you know, a part of your humanity, a part of maybe the screwed up things that you're going through as a result of your really like dysfunctional environment, it's now seen as basically something inherently wrong with you. So in that way, this kind of childhood diagnosis creates what you could call like a sort of like a second-class citizen effect, where we're essentially treated as less than fully human, and then this shapes how we understand ourselves. And, you know, it's very, very sad and very, very abusive, quite frankly. And, you know, I get a little emotional thinking about all the lives that have likely been destroyed by this kind of dynamic. And so in all these ways, it creates distrust of oneself. And so it's amazing to eventually realize that like none of these things were about us, right? We were just responding to environments that were maybe repressive and authoritarian, and we didn't like them because maybe they suck. And I think like just by beginning to sort of wake up to all of this, we can begin to kind of like reconnect with that sort of self-trust that gets broken. And that experience and that process is very amazing, but there are definitely some pitfalls to it that I've learned. One of them, which is a trap that I fell into, was like trying to rush the process too much, right? So like initially we see like we start to understand intellectually what happened, and that's a huge and very exciting part of the process. But just understanding it intellectually doesn't mean that all of our conditioning has changed, right? It doesn't mean that like our identity is fully changed. It doesn't mean that we've kind of transcended all of this. So there's those two levels. And like that second piece, it doesn't change overnight, right? It changes by consistently bringing new awareness to yourself and to your life over time. And, you know, perhaps that can happen faster than we think. I mean, I think like with a fair amount of focus, you know, it hasn't taken a lifetime for me. And I feel like very much like I've removed all these kind of toxic layers of it. I'm still growing and healing as a person, of course, but like that really toxic part of it that we really want to get rid of, I feel like I have gotten rid of it, but it took time and it doesn't happen overnight. And so I think like that's the first thing is just, you know, be patient, recognize, you know, embrace the process, right? It's not going to happen overnight. I think another pitfall that we can run into is kind of focusing too much on like litigating the past and identifying too much with our story and what happened. I mean, I think like understanding it intellectually on some level is important, which is some of what this video is about. But I think that it can be easy to kind of spin too much in that, and we can get kind of stuck in some of the negative emotions that are associated with that. And so I think like, again, just like really embracing the process of kind of doing the inner like emotional transformation work that ultimately is kind of is at the core of all of this, and is at the core of kind of healing from all of this, I think. And so there are some things that I think are really helpful in this whole process. One, a really big one is to just learn to kind of like relate to our own emotions and our own inner life in a way that is not colonized by clinical authority. So it's like learning to kind of put these things into our own words, learning to be present with those things. And in that way, we become the authority over our own inner life rather than having somebody else who, you know, maybe is going to do a really bad job, right? Having that kind of authority, like this authority, you know, that sort of came into our lives that we didn't consent to when we were kids and potentially after. So it's really about like kind of like getting rid of those things that shaped us that we didn't consent to. And another, I think, is just like learning to move past diagnostic framing as a way, as something that we need to exist in the world, because it isn't. And I think, you know, a really big like meta aspect of all of this, which I've touched on, is just like learning to be present in our body, right? And meditation is really helpful for that. I think like that is often the basis of kind of finding our own inner authority in the face of, you know, all these different experiences and all these different like forces that were taking us out of that. If we can be present in our body and we can like learn to do that consistently and do that more and more and do that better and better, then we are able to kind of just like really reclaim a lot of our own power that our environments maybe didn't really tolerate. And I think another thing that's helpful is like learning to notice, and this is kind of the conditioning piece that I was touching on. It's like learning to notice when we are outsourcing our own authority, like to understand ourselves and to understand our own inner life, right? Rather than just like being present with what is there. Because I think like when we're present with what is there, we're learning to kind of sit with the uncertainty and the discomfort. Something that's more truthful can emerge here. And, you know, something that can be really helpful for that, especially early on, is finding people who we feel like can understand this and can kind of help to reinforce that, right? So it's like we're experiencing these things, we're sitting with them, and then we're able to talk to somebody who actually understands it, then they can help to kind of like reinforce that, you know. And like I found that with like certain really like-minded friends, like-minded mentors. It can be hard to find, and I don't think it's strictly necessary, because often it is just like we just feel like we can't find it. But that for me at times help to kind of accelerate the process. But at the end of the day, it's really just like all about learning to rebuild trust in our own first person, authentic experience, allowing our own emergent inner life to come forward. Ultimately, I think so that we can get back to this kind of vocation of self-definition. At the end of the day, nobody gets to define our own inner lives. Nobody is or should be entitled to that. No diagnostic framework, no ideology, no mental health professional, no, you know, trauma guru, no spiritual influencer, nobody. So these are just some thoughts that I'm sketching out here on recognizing that your childhood diagnosis was wrong, or like, you know, recognizing that for yourself because you believe it. And then what to do from there, potentially, like how to look at these things, how do you navigate it? It's a really big and really tricky area, but I think that like there are some good ideas out there for how we can potentially navigate that. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I really hope you liked it. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And also please share this video with anybody who you think it might be relevant for. My goal is really to just kind of get these resources out there to whoever needs it. Thank you again, and I look forward to having you next time.